Welcome to the Upfront Podcast, where you get your weekly dose of upfront discussions with people from all around the world. On this episode, my guest is Sam, who goes by the pronouns of they and them. For the listeners that are not aware, this means Sam does not identify as on the binary spectrum, meaning neither female or male. Sam and their family moved to Israel from California in the United States when they were 11 years old and became an advocate for intersectional disability and mental health. They call themselves the Disabledreamer, which is also their Instagram handle. Sam is a writer and is currently also studying. We will talk about gender identity, disability, mental health, and how Sam handles living with cerebral palsy. This is part 1 of 2 of this interview. This is a content warning. Please be aware that this episode contains topics that some listeners may find difficult to listen to. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, Sam. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Nina?
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Thank you for being on this week's episode. I'm really thrilled.
Thank you for having me. It's such a fun opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you please tell me a bit about yourself?
So yeah, I'm Sam. I use pronouns they, them. I am a writer, a university student, and I'm disabled. So I write also a lot about my struggles with disability and mental health and accessibility. I'm in school for information sciences and English literature, and I'm doing a teaching diploma as well to be able to teach English.
Oh, amazing. Online at the moment, or can you do some of it in person?
So it was for a while, actually, most of the semester was in person, which was great. The last week of the semester went back to being on Zoom, but most of it has been lucky to be in person. And I'm hoping we can kind of continue that because we did like 2 years just on Zoom, and that was not nice.
Yeah, I bet. It's quite a change, right?
Yeah, there isn't a lot of interaction. There's no social interaction. There's no like hallway run-in with people and really get to know your classmates. You kind of all just show up for the Zoom class, and there's really a lot less like conversing and really meeting people.
Yeah, definitely. I think that changes the whole experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes it a lot more isolating as well. Like people are like, "Oh, you went to university to like make friends." I'm like, "Yeah, but you have to meet people in person for that. No one's making friends over Zoom classes."
Yeah. So how are you doing like with the pandemic right now?
So I'm a little like burnt out. I think I did a lot better in the beginning of the pandemic than I think I thought I would deal with. And I think that's because I was already dealing with like a lot of continuous like internal chaos in my mind. So when it was finally chaotic outside, I was like, oh, that's cute. My life is always this chaotic. It kind of matched the inside and outside. So I was like, I mean, mind you, I still struggled, but I struggled like in a very personal breakdown, not really anything to do with COVID. And I already lived on my own, so it wasn't so stressful in a sense of it was isolating, but it wasn't as isolating. I wasn't used to living with tons of people, and then I was then needed to be on my own, so it wasn't as hard that way.
Oh, I just saw this article being published, I think this morning actually, where they spoke about Israel having like a mental health pandemic alongside the COVID pandemic. So I think that is a struggle for many people to balance some sort of normalcy.
Absolutely. I was hospitalized twice. They were completely like they really didn't have to do much with the pandemic. Like the first one, I had like a huge emotional mental breakdown at like the end of a final season in September of like 2020. And when I was at the psych ward, when I was in the hospital, they were consistently full. Like someone would be discharged and there would be intake, and someone would be discharged and there would be intake, and they didn't even have enough rooms to really consistently take people in. And also the staff had been cut. There were budget cuts, so there were less staff, there was less social workers, there were less groups that were going on. Because I had been hospitalized at that hospital previously in 2019, and there was a lot more care. So I even noticed during the pandemic that they had less care to offer, and they were slammed in both places that I ended up going in June of this past year. I also ended up being hospitalized for a week in a different place, and I mean, they're just so understaffed to begin with. Like their mental health care in this country is problematic to begin with. It needs a rework. There's a lot of issues with it. but there's not enough staff to ratios to patients, and then even the staff that they have, they don't necessarily even have the right tools and skills to actually help the patients. So there's just a lot of issues that really need to be worked with in this mental health care in this country.
Yeah, that's interesting actually to hear that from somebody who's like experienced it firsthand. What do you mean by they're not equipped with the tools to help people correctly?
I think there some of the training is just it's not adequate. Like this hospital that I was at in June, I didn't even want to necessarily go to this hospital. I took myself to the hospital. I was feeling suicidal, and they offered me to go to this hospital. That was the only hospital they had, and it's like the city ones, right? So you go on rotation. So I had spoken to my psychiatrist, and she was like, try to get into this like more privatized program in the morning. So I had my therapist call in the morning. I like went to go sleep at a friend's house, whatever. Um, and they called and they're like, well, we have a wait list, we can get her in 6 weeks. And my therapist was like, she's suicidal now. 6 weeks is, you can't have a mental health center for like acute crisis and be like, we can take her in
Mm-hmm.
6 weeks. We have no space. So I went to this other hospital, but it was not equipped to help me in the right way, because they were like, you don't even really belong here, because my mental health crisis was very specific. It was very suicidal, but I'm also very cognizant of my problems. I'm not like, I took myself to the ER. I told my family, called my psychiatrist. I'm like, I need to go to the ER. I'm suicidal and I need to get help. So a lot of the people in this hospital were not that cognizant and were like very problematic. They had a lot of issues and they weren't being given the right care. And they didn't even know how to ask for the right care. So I knew how to ask for what I wanted. And all the therapists and nurses there and everyone was like, you don't belong here, because like all we're doing here is watching you that you don't hurt yourself, which was like what I needed in that exact moment. But they're like, long term, we don't have what to give you. And I was like, I was really sad because my roommate actually had been there for like 4 months and she was just suicidal like me. But I was there in a week and I was out because I had all these other tools that I knew how to help myself with. And it was really sad to see this person who, with a little bit of tools and help, could be outside of a hospital. And instead, she's cycling back in between the psych wards because they don't know how to actually, like, you can't just give meds for suicidal thoughts. Like, that's not really the action. So they really don't have like modern tools in which to deal with things. Like, if your problem isn't being solved by upping your meds or re-putting you back on your meds that you don't take when you're outside the hospital, they don't have so many skills really to like integrate you back into society and really long term help you be better.
So what ended up happening after that? Did you get
So
transferred to like a new psychiatrist or something like that, or?
so I switched to a different psychiatrist. I found a much better psychiatrist. My issue in June was quite acute. My brother had gotten married to my best friend, and I had done a lot of the work for the family. Like, I
Mm.
planned all our outfits, I got us organized, I got custom people for everything. I was very hands-on. Like, I organized a lot more of this wedding than I planned to be.
The kind of sibling you want to have, right?
Yeah, no, it was great, but also because I was her very close friends with her, I was also, happily doing like, Pinterest boards and talking flowers and design and all these different things, but it was just a lot and I was still in school full time. And my family has, its own set of problems, and that's kind of why I got very involved. My parents weren't really able to be involved. But that was just a whole lot of stress on top of, my regular mental health issues and school and a
Mm-hmm.
pandemic and like
Mm-hmm.
Shabbos Sheva Brachos. Like, that just got to be a point. It was like, wow, I can't actually handle what's going on right now.
Yeah, I understand that. That's got to be a lot. I could only imagine. So you actually do a lot of advocating for mental health and disability awareness, but let's stick with the mental health for a minute. Um, how are you personally handling your mental health now? Is there anything you do on like a daily basis, a weekly basis, something that you could maybe even recommend to like listeners who might be having a difficult time or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do a few things. First of all, I see my therapist weekly. It's like non-negotiable. Like, people are like things on Monday. I'm like, no, Monday at this hour. This is when I'm busy. It's like very much, even when I don't want to go. I mean, there are plenty of times when I'm like, I don't really have patience for the session. And I think those sessions are almost more helpful, because why don't you want to go? What's going on that you don't want to talk about? And so that's very non-negotiable. I also take medication. I think it's a tool that's underutilized in a way, because I think people are afraid of the stigma of it. I mean, I got
Mm.
pushback from my family when I first was recommended back in high school, and my parents didn't want to let me do it. So then it took me a long time to unlearn that stigma later on. And also finding a psychiatrist is hard. I've gone through many a psychiatrist. I now, in the hospital, I actually switched psychiatrists, and I found one that's top notch. I think it's very important. You don't always necessarily need all the different meds, but I think a lot of in society, we're even afraid to set up a meeting with a psychiatrist and say, I might need meds. I don't know what's going on. Can we talk? And then they can talk to you, they can talk to your therapist, and like actually build a team of people around you. Because then when you have issues, then it's easier to like get on the phone with a psychiatrist, and they can help you decide if you need to go to the hospital, if you need to go to the ER. I think we're very afraid to talk about our problems to a lot of people. And I think the idea of like a mental health doctor, they come across as they're expensive, they're bothersome, they're hard to get to. And I think, especially in Israel, you usually pretty much need to go private because it's very hard and takes a long time to get their psychiatrist through the healthcare. So I think a lot of people are just like, no, I'm fine. Everyone's struggling. It's like, yes, everyone's struggling, but you don't need to struggle that hard. Like, I think we also get used to stuck in this like pity Olympics, right? It's like, well, someone's struggling harder than me, like worse than me. And I definitely used to do that a lot more. And
To
then
like
it's like, no, but
rationalize it.
yeah, you rationalize your struggle and be like, well, I don't need help because this person who has it harder than me isn't getting help either. And it's like, well, that's really sad that they're not getting help, but that really doesn't mean that you don't need help or can't get help to make your life better.
Is there a certain point you think where people should actually go and get professional help? Is there sort of a breaking point where you think that is sort of an indication that you need like external help, that you can't do it by yourself?
So I can speak from the point of like depression and anxiety. I can't speak to the stronger like mental health disorders like bipolar
Mm-hmm.
and more genetic type disorders.
Right.
But speaking from depression wise, I think if you're stuck in a fog that you can't remember what's going on and you're not functioning on your daily tasks for 2 weeks, that's like 2 to 3 weeks is enough to be where it's not, and it doesn't really matter. People are like, oh, it's a pandemic, so life's harder. Right, exactly. So you should have a tool to make your life easier. Like just because it's depression that's maybe been triggered by the pandemic, that definitely doesn't mean you should be like, well, I'll just wait till the pandemic ends. And if I still need help then, then I'll get it. It's like, no, you can get help now and you don't have to stay long term on medication. I think that's also a huge fear with people is like, well, now that I have to be on meds forever. And I choose to be on meds right now. And I think they're super important for me. And when people tell me, oh, you're doing great, you don't need meds, I'm like, I'm doing great because I have my meds. But that's my perspective and it works for me. And I don't think everyone needs to be on meds forever. And you don't have to be on meds forever. I've had certain doctors tell me if you wanted to maybe go off meds, if your life ever got super simple, then you could go off meds. I'm like, great, my life's not super simple. I'm disabled, I'm queer, my family's religious. Like, I don't know, I have a lot going on for it to be like simple. I don't ever feel like I have a simple life. But I think reach out before you think you need to reach out. Reach out when it's like, oh, I wonder what's going on and if it can be better. Oh, I'm sitting on my couch for 2 weeks and I'm not really functioning. It doesn't need to be sitting in the shower crying with the water running down, like having a complete mental breakdown like they show in the movies. Like I think we also wait till we're at this, breaking point to get help. And you can get acute help and you absolutely should get acute help. And if you're suicidal, you should go to the ER. But you can also get help when you're just struggling and for 2 weeks and don't feel well and need to speak to someone and need to speak to a psychiatrist and think that possibly you can get help. Psychiatrists also aren't super pill pushers. Like I think we as a society assume that every psychiatrist is like getting kickbacks and just wants to push meds on you. And that's not the case. If you go to a good psychiatrist, they're going to sit and listen to you and discuss what they think you could be taking that could help you. So I think not to be afraid of that stigma, that issue, and really do reach out to get the help.
So you think psychiatrists usually tend to, like, I'm generalizing here, but usually tend to give medication as a supplement to like the therapy that you're doing in person or over Zoom or whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Every psychiatrist I've spoken to has asked me if I'm in therapy. They don't usually like just prescribing and sending you on your way. Like if you're trying to get help, they're going to ask you, they want you to see a holistic view of help, and get a holistic view of help. And I would recommend that. I don't think, just taking medication is necessarily the only should be done on its own. I think it's very helpful in tandem. I think sometimes it can be the start of giving space in your brain in order to deal with issues. Obviously, to some extent, the medication it's masking certain issues to be able to give you enough space in order to deal with issues and also to function, which is very important. But yeah, I don't think psychiatry is ever enough on its own, but also a good psychiatrist will tell you that. Every psychiatrist that I've been to has always asked me first thing, who's your therapist? Can we have a conversation? They don't really work independently. A good psychiatrist will know how to speak and require you to like have a therapist. Part of a team. I mean, part of mental health is it's building out your own team of people. I think we have this idea in society that we have to be independent. I had that for such a long time. As a disabled person, I was like, I have to be independent and no one can help me and I can't take help from anyone because then I'm proving I'm not independent. And it took me a very long time, probably till like, I don't know, 24, 25, to realize getting help and having a team of people to help you doesn't mean you're not independent. It means you're building a team of people to help you run. Like, no one's actually independent. This like societal view that we have to do everything on our own and the self-made man is super harmful, because then when we reach out to get help, it's looked upon as, oh, you're so weak you can't do it on your own. But the people who really achieve the most aren't actually doing it on their own.
I think you also picked up on something that I find very interesting is the language of things and how we phrase things. Like you mentioned when you're not functioning anymore, but I think there's also a sort of a misconception around the word of people functioning. Oh, I can function, like I'm still going to work, I'm still doing this and that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually working for them and that they're happy and satisfied.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, functioning is such a fake word. My therapist has told me many times, she's like, I've been struggling with being suicidal and have been a very deep depression. And I'll still go to class every day and I'll put a fake smile on my face and no one will know the difference. So I think, yes, there are some days where I'm also stuck in a haze in a dark room and I can't get out of bed. But that's not the only way I've been depressed. I've been depressed and suicidal and sat in a classroom and gotten into arguments about women's rights. Like, it's not, I think there is that illusion with depression and anxiety that unless you're having a panic attack in a dark closet, you're not struggling. And the struggles can look different every day. And I think it's harder when you kind of lie to yourself, right? Because you're like, oh, I'm functioning, I'm going to school. It's not like I have 2 weeks of dishes piled up in my sink and I haven't ordered groceries or eaten food in 2 days. Like the struggle looks different. And I think for a long time, also mentally, we like to kind of lie to ourselves about our struggles sometimes because it's like, well, I don't really want to be struggling again. Mask it. And then, but eventually it all crumbles down. And sometimes if we can unmask it in a bit of a different point, then it makes it easier to get the help before you having a complete meltdown. Like get the help, go to the hospital. I've done it a bunch of times, but every time I go, I'm like, wow, I really wish to some extent, like I would have gotten different help. And sometimes it just wouldn't have happened. And I needed to go and have the complete breakdown in order to get to the next place in my life. But I think sometimes, especially like my last hospitalization in June, had I put up better boundaries and just did less and whatever, and there wouldn't, it happened the way it happened. And I kind of let it happen because I had my own mental, hangups with it. But getting help when you don't think it's as bad as you think it is, because you always won't think it's as bad as it is, can be very helpful and like require less of a complete like freeze in your life to get help.
Yeah, I think also a lot of people tend to think that they're themselves are like strong enough and they're not the type to be having like some issues, mental health problems, whatever it is, or that they just simply need help in whatever way or form. For some people, it might be about something which is really difficult, about something very heavy. Other people might simply need help with like something that to others might seem benign, but isn't, right?
Yeah, I think that that's the comparisonitis. And I think also with society's view of what what we put also in society and like socially. And I posted like a video like the first time I went to the hospital, because I remember the
Hmm.
night before I went, it was like a little bit more planned. I had come home. It took us a few days to find the hospital, etc. And I was like very stressed about going because I hadn't even watched a whole lot of horror movies. But the first image that came to my mind of a psych ward is like bars and all these dark, cringy places and like super sketchy. And to be
Mm.
fair, like the second hospital I ended up going to in June was like sketchy. But I think we assume the worst and we allow society's version of, oh my gosh, the mental health is like so creepy. And if you have problems, and there's a lot of stigmatization also in the media of especially people with bipolar or different disorders that are much more stigmatized. Like depression and anxiety, I think has become like a flat, like, oh, that's all the mental health issues. And I think that's a big issue because they're much stronger, like harder mental health issues that are still stigmatized in a much larger way. I think bipolar, especially in the media, and like you're crazy and whatever. And I think it makes it harder for people to get help again because it's, oh, but I can't get help for that. Like that's going to make me like this crazy character. And you need to really blank out what society or what you think society is going to say about you for getting the help.
Yeah, dealing with societal expectations. I think that generally that is a very interesting point too, because we're now at a stage where I feel like most people feel more liberated, being more themselves, feel more comfortable in their identity. But at the same time, I feel like there is still a lot of like stigma, as you said. Do you ever feel like your mental health is getting better? Is like continuously improving, or is there just like a phase in between sort of breakdowns, if I may call them that, and it's not really getting anywhere better?
So I think I've used the term spiral, and I think my therapist and I have used it, and a lot of different people have used it. I think I'm one of those people that are always going to have breakdowns. I think that's partially like mentally, I'm like very empathetic and very empathic. And that's a lot of like, so I take on a lot of emotion and like, whether it's internally or externally, a lot of pressures. I think I learn how to get to these breakdowns from different places. Like I learn new tools, I'm able to get different help. And I think I am learning also to see the symptoms of what will lead me to a breakdown. Do I think I'll never have another breakdown? No, I think that's really cute. I think I'll have plenty of breakdowns. Do I
Mm.
think they'll be the same intensity and need the same level of care? I don't think so. I also think we're afraid of breaking down. When I broke down and went into the hospital in September, I was having a complete internal breakdown of being non binary and kind of transgender and this whole other mental issue. And I really didn't have a place to process it. And my mind and body were like, you have to process this because I'm someone who goes straight to the truth and really doesn't play around with bullshit. And like, I have to live my life from a sense of my truth. And when that's not working, everything kind of breaks down and I have to refine that truth. So I don't think I won't ever have any breakdowns, but I also don't think that that's necessarily everyone's path and everyone's story. I also feel like even though I tell my story, I'm also very careful when I've had people reach out to me and they're like, da da da. And I'm like, that's my story. Just because I've had this many breakdowns doesn't necessarily mean because you're struggling with depression and anxiety right now that you are now going to have like breakdowns like I am. I think
Mm.
even within telling my own story, it's very important to kind of remind people that you're still going on your own path. I mean, I think it's important to not be afraid of breakdowns. I've come to kind of lean into it and see, what am I learning? What's going on that's not working? And sometimes it's as simple as you didn't have the right boundaries and your body and mind are completely burnt out and you can't do this again. And then sometimes it's you are non-binary, you are transgender, and you're going to have to sit and figure out your pronouns and figure out what's going on in your mind because you can't live like this anymore because it's not your authentic truth. So I think those are just
Mm.
different boundaries, but I also don't think everyone goes through that. And I don't think you have to. I don't think you have to go through complete mental and emotional breakdowns to find who you are. Sometimes people need to, sometimes people don't. So I think it's much more dependent on kind of your story and where you are. I mean, I hope I don't have as many breakdowns because I hope I'm living more in my truth consistently and kind of finding the small tweaks on my own and with my therapist or with my psychiatrist about where I'm struggling or even with my friends and kind of figuring it out in different ways. I mean, going to a psych ward every time you have a mental breakdown is a lot. It's hard. You still come out with like different scars and issues. You learn a lot, but I think I've learned a lot in those terms and ways.
It's also very individual, right? Hardly any person has the same story, right? And the background and everything that, yeah, makes a big difference, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think anyone has the same story. Even the
Mhm.
person who was, in the bed across from me, who was also there in the hospital for being suicidal, I mean, she had a completely different story. I didn't have the space and energy to hear it, so I don't know her story. The symptoms might be similar, but the stories, you know, might also have similar overlaps. I mean, I think as individual as we are, I think we go through a lot more of like things as a public, like the whole Me Too movement, and realizing that so many more people have been harassed or abused or raped or etc. I think there's so much more of understanding that your struggles aren't so unique. And I think people are afraid to say that. And I'm like, no, I'd
Mhm.
rather have a bunch of people who understand my struggles because we all have similar ones. I don't think it's ever one and the same, but I think it's a lot more similar than people want to admit to.
Yeah, no, I think it also helps you feel like, all right, there's other people who also maybe feel the same way and like not identical, but I think that helps because it gives you that sense of like community in a way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Community is so important in that way. I think community is so important in many different ways. Like, I've noticed that I really don't have a huge disabled community around me at this point, and I lack it in certain times. I have like more friends online right now who are like disabled and actually with intersectionality of being queer.
Mhm.
I have found a lot more of those people. It is so important to community, and we don't have all the same problems. I mean, the people who are disabled and queer have different disabilities than me, but we all deal with certain ableism and lack of accessibility and struggles with this, that, and the other that are similar enough where we can vent to each other and have a sounding board in a community and just kind of get each other. Sometimes it's not even saying anything. It's just kind of DMing them and be like, I got you. I know this vibe. This is what I deal with all the time. And it's just the lack of feeling alone. I think we struggle in society with like the idea of independence and being individual, but also then we're still struggling because inherently as a society and people, we do want to have community. And I think that kind of clashes a lot.
Yeah, definitely. So, can I ask you, because I do feel like the less stigmatized mental health issues or mental health in general is, the better for our society, of course. I feel like there's some people who actually need to get a diagnosis of what it is that they're suffering from or experiencing or anything like that. And then there's other people who are afraid to get a diagnosis that they might be sort of scared of, like you mentioned before, like bipolar. Do you think that in every case, a psychiatrist will give you a definite like diagnosis of what you are suffering from or what you're going
So
through?
a good psychiatrist really shouldn't like give you a diagnosis in 50 minutes. Like, you
Mm.
should go one or two times unless you have very blanket issues that are so obvious. But actually the psychiatrist at the hospital, like, she met me for a total of like 5 to 10 minutes and gave me a whole new diagnosis. I was like,
Oh
you
wow.
haven't even spoken to me for an hour. You've decided that I'm an entirely different diagnosis than I was. And these diagnoses had overlap, but my therapist was like, she can't give you a diagnosis in 5 minutes. I don't care what's written in your history. You cannot get a diagnosis in 5 minutes. Um, I think diagnosis can be helpful. I think it's important to also not let it necessarily like run your life. Like, yes, I have depression and anxiety, and I find that very helpful. And I have like recently figured out that I also have ADHD. And that's helpful to me because I can use different tools and learn more about it in order to help me. I
Mm,
think, especially for harder and stronger, harder in quotation marks type idea of disability, mental health disabilities, I think it's important because it can help you navigate the world in a little bit of a different way. It helps you understand yourself, and then it also can help others around you help you. But the diagnosis isn't the end of the story. Like, the diagnosis is definitely the beginning of it. Then you can go to different people, different therapists, different psychiatrists, and really work with the diagnosis. I think it's not
mm,
always necessarily so easy to get. Your diagnosis might also evolve throughout the times, but I do think there is something helpful with a diagnosis. I think, especially seeing that also from the disabled community and the chronic pain community, when you have all these issues and you can't put a label to it and you spend time going to doctors for them to figure out the puzzle of you, it can be very demoralizing because you also feel like nobody has this, no one has all these weird symptoms together. And again, it's that isolating feeling. And I think labeling things makes it much easier. I think I've also seen that from like the disability community, but also from the LGBTQ community, when people from the outside are like, why would you label yourself? And why would you that? And I'm like, because it's part of my identity, and part of figuring out and connecting your whole identity is being able to label the parts of you and really put it together in a whole thing. It doesn't mean that that's the only part of you, but definitely being able to figure out labels, and they might evolve. They definitely evolve. But I think that also creates a space for you to find community, because if you're in this unlabeled world, yes, you can go into any mental health Facebook groups and whatever, but when you also are able to find those maybe 4 or 5 or 20 people that have very similar issues under the same diagnosis as you, you can get a lot more tips and tricks and feel a lot more validated within your struggles.
Yeah, I think that's why I asked, is because I do feel like it's sort of like some people do tend to not necessarily want, but are looking to get a diagnosis eventually, so that it can actually go and like research and like have that diagnosis and put that to use. Maybe go look for a support group and Google different experiences and look up what other like symptoms there may be that they haven't experienced. But then also I feel like some people might be scared of getting help or hesitant of getting help because they are fearing that diagnosis for themselves. Like I think a lot of like stigma is internalized as well, right? If they feel like they're going to get a diagnosis and then they're going to read all of these like symptoms that they are not experiencing, and then they're like scared, and that influences their mental well-being as well. But do you think you could also tell your therapist like that you don't want a diagnosis? Is that possible?
So I think it would depend on the therapist, but also therapists are not going to diagnose you. Like most therapists I don't even think are technically even allowed to diagnose you. I think a diagnosis does have to come from a psychiatrist. I think it's also important to work on what the fear is really deep down of being diagnosed, because I think that has more to do, oh, well, then like us be socially stigmatized. It's like partially, but a lot of those people are so afraid of like, it's a different thing of like, do you want to know the truth, or do you want to like pull the wool over your eyes? And I think it takes a minute to do it. And I think there is a whole lot of internal stigma that's internalized from society. But I think the more you can realize that society is so flawed and that it's not really worth following along what society's doing. Like if 2 years into a pandemic, we haven't learned that the majority of the way society deals with things is so problematic and not really helpful for anyone, and we can't do things differently, I think only harms us. Like at the end of the day, not getting help harms you. It harms people around you long term. If you are a parent and you don't get mental health care, it can harm your children in many ways. I wouldn't be afraid. People shouldn't be giving you out diagnoses in 5 minutes anyway. And you can discuss with your therapist why you don't want to hear the diagnosis and like work through those struggles. I think it's more to do with that.
This was part 1 of this interview. Part 2 will follow next week. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Upfront Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on any new episodes. We will be back next week.